Okay, so I want to welcome you to presentation number 5, the Great Reset, when God allows a civilization to die. So I think we've already established the fact that humanity is messed up, right? I don't know that I need to convince a lot of you of this fact. You just have to open the news, right? On any given day and recognize there's a lot of really twisted and bad stuff that happens every day, right? In this world. And we were all born with sinful human natures bent towards evil. So I've talked about that already. For those of you who've gotten a copy of my book, The Last Crisis, in there's a much more comprehensive view or explanation of that nature. And so I encourage you to take the time to read that book. If you're coming online and you're watching this and there's a way for you to get in touch with us, we can get a copy of that book out to you if you indicate your interest in having that book. But that book does explain in a lot more detail than what I can do here on why human beings have this natural, sinful human nature bent. And it really, when you understand it, it opens your eyes to be able to understand why this world is as messed up as it is. Now, there are 5 major kingdoms from Daniel's day to ours. Right? Recurring theme, right? What was that first kingdom? Babylon, and then Medo-Persia, then Greece, then Rome, and then, yes, the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of Jesus Christ. That's right. Jesus Christ is the king of the final kingdom. So does it matter to God how we worship him? Right? Do you think that it matters to God? Yes, it matters to God, right? Genesis chapter 4, we see this story of an example of when worship was not applied the way God wanted. That's the story of Cain and Abel. We read about it starting verse 3. It says, "So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell." Right? And so then it says, the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desires for you, but you must master it." So Adam and Eve had been driven from the garden because of their sin. And Adam and Eve expected a deliverer based on the promise that they find in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. It said, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." This was a reference to Jesus Christ, the person of Jesus Christ. When Cain was born, they thought, here's the man-child. Here's the one who's going to be our deliverer. They had high hopes for him. But God would have explained to Adam how to worship and what to sacrifice, right? And here they were, Cain and Abel, going to sacrifice to God, giving homage to God, and one does it right and the other one does it wrong. Cain didn't even bring the first fruits of his garden. If you think about it here, first fruits, simply being, is the first tomatoes, the first cucumbers, the first plant. You ever notice, if any of you have ever had a garden, or if you know someone who's had a garden, nobody ever gives away the first tomatoes, right? Nobody ever gives away the first cucumbers, right? Or the first of anything that comes out of the garden, because you're excited. You spent a long time working the soil, planting the seed, weeding for all this kind of time, getting everything prepared. And finally, now the garden is producing. What do you want to do with those first fruits? You want to eat them for yourself. Keep them for yourself. God asked in ancient times that you would take that first fruit and give it to him. And that's a true sacrifice, right? Rather than eat it for yourself, you're giving it to God. And of course, in the ancient system, in the sacrificial system, that would then go to the priests. The priests would get the first tomatoes and the first cucumbers and so on and so forth, right? Not that I necessarily know if they had cucumbers or I think they had leeks and things like that. I know that much, and garlic and stuff like that. And I know that because the children of Israel were complaining when they were in the desert that they didn't have it from Egypt. So those things did exist. Anyway, Point being is that Abel's sacrifice was the first fruit of his flocks. In God's kingdom, the firstborn is dedicated to him. And so that's the first fruit, right? The one that opens the womb. And in this case here, Abel's sacrifice was the first fruit of his flock. Unfortunately, verse 8 records, Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. So Cain was so upset at the fact that God recognized Abel's sacrifice and not his, that he decided, I'm going to get rid of Abel, that goody two-shoes. And he murdered him. It was the first murder in history. First instance of religious persecution and martyrdom in history. It's because Abel was following God's commands and he was worshiping God the way God had asked him. And Cain knew the way he was supposed to worship, but he didn't like the fact that his sacrifice wasn't accepted. Is there a right way to worship God? There is. And what did God try to tell him? Listen, if you do what is right, you'll get the blessing. But Cain, rather than do what is right and would not humble himself, he instead decided, I'm going to get rid of the one who made me look bad. And he took out Abel. And this is the first instance, as I said, of religious persecution, but unfortunately it's far from the last. For millions and millions of people have lost their lives because they would not bend. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we saw in the previous chapter, right? Previous presentation. They were willing to die rather than to compromise their worship or their faith. And here we had Abel, who literally was the first one to lose his life because he was faithful to God, and Cain was not. Now, did Adam and Eve fail to raise their kids right? Do you think? It really, I believe, highlights the impact of the corrupt nature that they inherited because of sin, right? Is because here Cain got angry, and anger, the ultimate fruit of anger, is murder, right? Whatever you're angry on, you're going to get rid of. In fact, there is a text where Jesus says, I tell you, the one who is angry with his brother is already guilty of murder, because that's the ultimate fruit of anger, right? So this is what happens. Now, of course, then it continues. The text continues. The Lord said to Cain, where's your brother Abel? Where's Abel, your brother? And he said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And when you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. This is huge. When Cain was a farmer, this was his livelihood. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden, and I will be a vagrant and a wanderer in the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So the Lord said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him. And then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So how we worship God matters. And worship, as you guys I think are already starting to pick up, is a recurring theme in the book of Daniel. And there's a reason for this, is because worship ultimately is the deciding factor for surviving the end of time. If we understand worship properly, then God will protect us from deception. He will protect us from the errors of Satan and will allow us to successfully get through to the end. If we treat God as a fool and think that we can just pick and choose like some kind of buffet, I'll just pick the food I like and I'm going to leave the food I don't like. I'm going to pick the beliefs that I like, but I'm going to leave the beliefs I don't like. You're going to find yourself in the end to not have the ability to stand up to the deceptions of Satan, and you will be deceived and ultimately will be lost. Worship matters to God. The same way when it comes to worship, really is about faithfulness to God, right? In the same way as in a marriage, a husband and a wife have to be faithful to each other. The way we worship God, God uses that, and he talks about spiritual adultery when we don't do it his way. There's only one true God in the universe, right? And every person will face the judgment seat of God. Revelation 22, 12 and 13, this is Jesus talking at the very end of the Bible, last chapter of the Bible, very end of the Bible. He says this, behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me to render to each man according to what he has done. I am the Alpha, which is like the alphabet, right? The first letter in the alphabet of Greek is alpha, and the omega, which is the last. So A to Z. I'm the A to Z, or if you're American, A to Z, right? The first and the last, the beginning and the end. He's the two bookends. He was before time began, and he will be forever as well. And so then each of us will have to deal with God. Proof that we've been saved by faith is that our actions demonstrate loyalty to God and his word. We can claim we believe in God, but that claim must be backed up by our actions. Talk is cheap, right? Belief without action is useless, right? Daniel 5 tells the story of a king that failed to worship God. We see here in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 1, this is Belshazzar. Just so you know, Belshazzar here this story happens about 20 years after Nebuchadnezzar has passed on. And there's about 4 kings that have come through. And so here we find Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. And when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar's father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And they brought the gold vessels that he had taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, of bronze, of iron, and wood, and stone. And suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. And then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints were slack, and his knees began knocking together. I should think so. If you see a hand, right, disembodied from a body and is writing on the wall, that cannot be a good thing, right? How many of you would be freaked out by that? I think I'd be freaked out by that too, right? That's kind of not something you see every day. And so then the king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. And the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his head and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. By the way, it's third ruler because he was second ruler. His father Nabonidus was the first ruler. And then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. And then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. So they knew something had happened, and they knew this was an ominous sign. They didn't know. The king didn't know what it was, and none of his wise men around him could tell him, right? Really, Belshazzar should have known about the stories of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. He did in fact know about those stories. These would have been told to him, right? And he would have heard about the dream of the statue and the fiery furnace and other exploits and the words of Daniel. And he would have known also about the Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of madness. But none of the wise men of Babylon could make sense of the text. And even though he knew all of these things, he apparently, as we'll see in the text shortly, didn't seem to know Daniel, which is a little bit surprising. I personally think, I suspect that he did know Daniel, but he was playing dumb in the process because he didn't want to look foolish in front of his 1,000 nobles, right? So the queen comes before him. The queen enters the banquet hall. The identity of this queen is a subject of discussion by commentators, and some think that this might even be the queen that was Nebuchadnezzar's queen, actually, the queen mother. We're not sure, though. But anyhow, this woman has wisdom when clearly the king is lacking some. And she enters the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. And the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. And this was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. So Daniel is now brought before the king, right? And then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who's one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father, the king, brought from Judah?" It almost seems like he's trying to remind Daniel of his place, right? You're one of those guys, right, that came in as an exile, captured. It says, "Now I've heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." Right? So Daniel, of course, says to him, like, keep your things, right? He answered and he said, "Keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription of the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed, and whomever he wished to spare, he spared alive. And whomever he wished, he elevated, and whomever he wished, he humbled." Meaning he had full sovereignty, right? Full power over human beings. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Right? He continues, says, "Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you" what? "Knew all this." So Belshazzar knew the story of Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure he knew the story of the fiery furnace. He knew the story of the statue. He knew the story of the fact that the kingdom of Babylon would eventually give way to another kingdom. And he knew that God was the one who had established Nebuchadnezzar, and God was the one who had taken him down. And what did Belshazzar do? But he and his nobles, they brought in the utensils and the cups from the temple. And that's bad enough for them to handle it, not being priests. But what did they do? They drank from them. More than that, they started to worship the gods that had made those things, the gods of gold and silver and stone. And so what was Belshazzar doing at that moment? He was proclaiming to God, "I don't believe in you, God. I don't recognize you, God. We're gonna ignore you, and we're gonna just do whatever we want to do." Right? And so God definitely was going to answer this challenge. Daniel continues, he says, "But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them, and you have been praising the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hands are your life breath and all your ways, you have not glorified." Then the hand was sent from him, and the inscription was written out. So Belshazzar is guilty of blasphemy. And what is blasphemy? Well, blasphemy is hurting the reputation of God or causing others to think poorly of God because of the way we have lived our lives and our faith. It can also be claiming to be God. That's another interpretation of blasphemy. But in the context here, Belshazzar, and you'll see in the context of even as we move on to Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8, you will see that blasphemy in Daniel is specifically talking about those who would represent God and yet would represent him poorly, or who would fail to recognize his sovereignty, who would twist his reputation. So here, Belshazzar had taken the things of God that are meant to be worshiped for God only and had instead used it for false worship. And he had brought reproach upon God and had thumbed his nose at God, and so therefore committed blasphemy. Romans 2:23-24 has this to say about the Jews and Gentiles, all of us. It says, you who boast in the law, you're specifically talking about the Jews, in this case, through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, just as it is written. And he says early in Romans 2, if you want to go and look it up, he's saying, are you who claim to be wise, have you become fools, right? You claim to be teachers and that you are blind. You don't practice what you preach. You preach against stealing and yet you steal, right? Have we seen that in churches, by the way? Where churches aren't doing what they're supposed to do, leaders aren't doing what they're supposed to do, right? God calls that blasphemy because we're misrepresenting God. Belshazzar knew the truth about God and he ignored it. And more than that, he used the utensils of the temple for false worship. So Daniel continues with this interpretation. He says, this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. And then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his head and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. But that same night, the Chaldean king was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So again, here we see an evidence of the fact that God was the one who put a person in place, and God is the one who takes them out, right? God allows rulers to achieve success, and he takes them out, right? The kingdom of Babylon is defeated. And in 539 BC, Cyrus invaded Babylonia, and Cyrus had the waters of the Euphrates diverted into a marsh, and then marched under the city walls, and entered the Babylon without a fight. And the kingdom of Babylon was defeated exactly as God had predicted through Jeremiah. Now there are some arguments. Belshazzar had a history, or a reputation, according to some historians, of being a cruel and difficult ruler, such that by some accounts he didn't have the support of the military and he didn't have the support of the priests. And in ancient times, that's a bad combination, right? If you lose the priesthood and you lose the support of the military. So there's indication, really. The question is, how did the gates stay up, right? Because there were actually gates that would block river access, but those gates were mysteriously left up. And then the question of, how did the king die? And most likely it was his own people that would have slain the king. We don't know that. We don't have those details. The point being is that he died just as he was predicted. Jeremiah 25:11-12 says, this whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Babylon will be judged. Then it will be, when 7 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation. And so we see that just as this was predicted many, many years before this happened, God predicted it through Jeremiah. This is exactly what came to be. And while Babylon did continue as a vassal state of Persia for a period of time, today, right, you have a city that's grown around the ancient site of Babylon, but the city itself was never rebuilt. It was never rebuilt, just like it was mentioned. Life may seem random, but it is guided by the unseen hand of God. The question we all have to ask ourselves is, will we surrender control to God? Right? Life may seem random, but God is in control. The world needs honest, God-fearing leaders who will be righteous. The world needs honest people who will stand up and be true to principle. And we see in Micah 6:8 what God expects of each of us. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. God is looking for people who will stand up and be true, who will be kind, who will be humble, who will be able to follow him and trust in him. There is a great reset coming, a final deception that will fool the whole world. And if you and I do not have the right understanding of truth, we will fall for that deception, I promise you. And in fact, much of Christianity has also bought into deceptions that have been planted, booby-trapped into their faith in such a way that will cause them to be deceived. 2 Thessalonians 2, 11 to 12, it says, "For this reason God will send upon them a deluding influence, that they will believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness." See, God is allowing this deception at the end of time in order to bring about the final events that will ultimately lead to the victory in Jesus. And yet, many, many people are going to be deluded. Partly they're going to be deluded because they want to be deluded. You remember how we saw last night on John chapter 3, right? Verses 18 and 19, I believe, where it talks about the fact that people they did not come to the light because their works were dark, or their works were evil, and they didn't want them to be exposed. Each of us has a choice, right? When we're faced with the truth, we have a decision to make. Will we move towards God, or will we move away from God? Will we follow him, or will we go against him? Ultimately, God calls any kind of worship that isn't his worship to be false worship. He calls it idolatry. He calls it spiritual adultery. We all have a choice to make, and that choice has serious consequences to it. And so the question for each of us is, what will we choose, right? Will we choose God, or will we choose to go our own way? And the consequences ultimately are grave. So the next presentation is going to be on the death of God. Presentation 6, the death of God. We're going to go over that